Highway 80 looked harmless in daylight, a long, sun-bleached ribbon across America's middle, dotted with half-forgotten towns, gas stations that smelled of burnt coffee, and motels whose neon signs blinked like failing heart monitors. But once the sun slipped behind the grain silos and the fields turned black, the highway changed into something else, something older, emptier, and hungry. Drivers who traveled it, often at night, spoke about the way the darkness thickened, as if it had weight, pressing against the windows, swallowing the space outside the headlights. They said it felt like the kind of road where things happened. Secrets were buried, and sometimes, if you weren't careful, you left a version of yourself behind on that asphalt forever. And for nearly 50 years, that feeling had a name: the Hitchhiker Murders. A spiraling constellation of disappearances, killings, sightings, and encounters that stretched across 5 states, dozens of jurisdictions, and 2 generations of terrified travelers. It began quietly in the summer of 1974, though no one realized it at the time. Hitchhiking was still common, especially among teens drifting between music festivals, Vietnam veterans trying to get home, or wanderers escaping small-town boredom. The first disappearance was written off as a runaway, the second as bad luck, the third as a tragic but unrelated murder near a Greyhound station. But then came the 4th, and the 5th, and the 6th. Some bodies appeared miles from where they were last seen, displayed in unsettling positions, hands folded neatly on their chest, eyes wide open, shoes missing from their feet, and personal belongings either stacked in strange patterns or burned to ash. Other victims were never found at all. Families pasted flyers in truck stops all the way to Wyoming, their printed faces fluttering in the wind while coffee-drinking drivers shook their heads and muttered, "Another one?" By the late 1980s, truckers began exchanging stories over late-night CB radio chatter. They described lone figures walking the shoulders of the road, always at night, never reacting to honks or shouted warnings. Some drivers swore they saw the same man, or what looked like a man, appearing miles apart in impossible timeframes. Others claimed they offered rides only to find their passengers vanish between 1-mile marker and the next, leaving behind nothing but the indentation of weight on the seat or the smell of wet earth. Most chalked it up to fatigue or hallucination, but a few believed the road itself was keeping a tally. The disappearances continued sporadically through the 1990s. Authorities never connected the dots, partially because the victims came from different backgrounds, ages, and states. Some were drifters, some tourists, some teenagers trying to reach a friend. Different counties handled cases differently, storing evidence in cardboard boxes that gathered dust in basements or sheriff's offices. No one thought to compare them because the pattern stretched too far, like a spider web, whose threads reached across borders. But there was another reason the cases stayed cold. The killer, or killers, left almost nothing behind. No fingerprints, no DNA, no consistent weapon, no obvious motive, just silence, and the eerie ritualistic details shared in every confirmed homicide: the missing shoes. Investigators speculated about symbolism, cult involvement, trophy collection, or psychosis, but the truth slipped through their fingers like gravel. What no one expected was the pattern's sudden return in 2011. The country had changed. Cell phones everywhere, dash cams becoming common, roadside cameras installed in most states, yet the killings resumed with the same chilling precision. A young woman left a Denver music festival and vanished 20 minutes after texting her roommate. Her body appeared 3 days later on a rural road shoulder, posed with her hands over her chest. A tourist backpacker hitchhiking toward Reno disappeared at dusk. Search dogs followed his scent for miles until it abruptly stopped on the pavement, as if he had been lifted off the ground. A college student traveling home for Thanksgiving vanished between 2 well-lit gas stations. Her phone was found smashed in an irrigation ditch, and her shoes were laid side by side beside a mile marker. Police departments scrambled to assure the public there was no evidence of connection, but retired detectives and amateur sleuths online disagreed. They saw the pattern, a sequence of vanishing spaced years apart, walking the spine of the interstate system like a shadow traveling with the seasons. When the FBI quietly reopened several cold cases in 2015, journalists sensed a shift in tone. Something had spooked the investigators. Something had convinced them the killings were not only related, but potentially ongoing. The story truly exploded when a whistleblower from a Colorado sheriff's office anonymously leaked a chilling detail: survivors. 3 people had escaped. Their testimonies described the same eerily calm driver, the same unsettling silence, the same sudden detour off the main road, and the same moment when dread washed over them. when they realized there was no safe way out except to jump. Authorities dismissed the leaked testimonies as exaggeration, but the rumor mill churned, and soon podcasts, documentary channels, and dark web forums began naming the unknown threat: the highway ghost, the walkaway man, the mile marker killer. But beneath the myths lay evidence that was all too real. Police sketches that resembled the same face drawn decades apart, abandoned cars found miles from their last known fuel-ups, and roadside graves uncovered beneath layers of soil compacted over years of passing truck traffic. And then there were the reports, always whispered, of a figure seen walking alone after midnight, matching no missing person's description, never stopping, never reacting, always appearing where the next victim would vanish. The deeper investigators dug, the more horrifying the timeline became. This wasn't a spree. It wasn't even a series. It was something that moved like a tide, retreating for years at a time, then returning without warning. A presence, a pattern, a predator. One that drifted through decades without aging in the witness descriptions, without altering its methods, and without making mistakes. Something that should have been impossible, unless more than one person was involved. Unless someone was continuing what another had started long before. The truth, investigators realized, was far worse than a serial killer hiding in America's vast, empty highway system. It was a system of killers, or a lineage, or something passed like a torch between travelers, drivers, hitchhikers, and wanderers. A cycle fed by the loneliness of the road, the anonymity of travel, and the simple act of stepping into a stranger's vehicle and shutting the door behind you. And as modern investigators would later uncover, the strongest lead linking all cases wasn't a fingerprint, weapon, or vehicle. It was a notebook. A battered, rain-warped notebook found in an impounded car, filled with hand-drawn maps and chilling notes written over 20 years. A notebook no one could explain. A notebook that should not have existed. A notebook that confirmed the disappearances were not random. They were chosen. Night after night, investigators would gather in dimly lit rooms, spreading out highway maps across long wooden tables, their fingers tracing the same routes again and again. The arteries of America, where countless hitchhikers vanished without leaving behind even a whisper of resistance. Scene 2 begins in the late 1970s, a time when hitchhiking was not seen as recklessness, but as freedom, a rite of passage, a way to drift through the country with only a backpack, a thumb, and the belief that most strangers were good. But the highways had shadows long before the world realized it, and the hitchhiker murders were already happening quietly, hidden beneath society's trust and naivety. One of the earliest patterns came from the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington, Northern California, where bodies were discovered in forest turnouts, ravines, and roadside ditches that only truckers and troopers ever stepped foot near. What law enforcement found most disturbing was not the brutality alone, but the intervals. Some victims appeared weeks apart, others hours. Some were last seen climbing into a sedan, others were found near truck stops, their final witnesses long gone. Even worse, some victims were never found at all, only their abandoned backpacks or scattered belongings surfaced as if the forest had swallowed them whole. The problem investigators faced was bigger than any single department. At the time, police stations did not communicate the way they do now. Missing person reports stayed local, evidence stayed in filing cabinets, and what one state called a sketchy disappearance, another called a runaway. It wasn't until certain detectives began comparing notes, late at night, often unofficially, that the bigger picture came into view. The same highways, the same victim type, the same disposal locations, and the same chilling silence left behind. Some investigators theorized that they were dealing not with one killer, but many, unconnected men who used the anonymity of the open road to commit crimes without pattern, motive, or fear. Others believed the opposite, that one or two highly mobile predators were slipping through the cracks, traveling from state to state, undetected. Among the most haunting stories from this period was that of a young woman, known for decades only as Highway Jane Doe. She was found near a logging road in 1979, her body carefully placed as if someone wanted her to be discovered. She had no identification, no missing person match, and no family came forward to claim her. The medical examiner concluded she had likely been hitchhiking based on her clothes, backpack strap marks on her shoulders, and the worn soles of her shoes. But what chilled investigators most was the detail that emerged later. Fibers on her clothing matched fibers found on two other victims located nearly 300 miles away. 3 states, 3 bodies, one unknown man traveling silently along the roads. And yet no name, no sketch, no lead ever solidified. But Highway Jane Doe was far from the only one. In many cases, all police had to go on were brief, fleeting witness accounts. A man with long hair and an old pickup, a clean-cut businessman who offered rides to young runaways, a trucker who always seemed to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. These descriptions overlapped constantly, and each time police thought they finally had a suspect, the trail turned cold, and another victim was found hundreds of miles away. Meanwhile, families searching for loved ones faced a nightmare system: jurisdictional dead ends, misfiled reports, assumptions that teenagers had simply run away. Many never even learned what state their child disappeared in. For a missing hitchhiker, the radius of possibility was infinite. Every mile was another thread in the web. Then came the strange coincidences. Several victims were found wearing pieces of clothing that didn't belong to them, jewelry that didn't match their tastes. A bracelet too big, a ring too small, a jacket clearly taken from someone else. Some investigators believed these were trophies carried from victim to victim by a single killer. Others believed something even darker, that victims were crossing paths indirectly, their belongings taken by different predators operating along the same routes. It created a chilling puzzle: highways filled with crossing lines, intersecting shadows, and killers whose paths may have unknowingly overlapped. Adding to the confusion were the false confessions. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, several incarcerated killers claimed responsibility for hitchhiker murders they had never committed. Some wanted fame, others wanted better prison privileges. A few simply enjoyed the attention. Each false confession consumed hours, days, sometimes months of investigative time, only to prove worthless. One infamous serial killer claimed more than 100 hitchhiker victims across over a dozen states. But when investigators started checking his timeline, it became clear he had been nowhere near the states where several victims were found. His confessions were lies designed to inflate his legacy and muddy the waters even further. And yet, for every false confession, there were real suspects who slipped through unnoticed. One truck driver was questioned after a hitchhiker escaped from his cab, running barefoot into a gas station bathroom and locking herself inside. She claimed he attempted to attack her with restraints hidden under his seat. He was detained briefly, questioned, then released due to lack of evidence. Months later, 3 bodies were found along his usual route, women who matched the same age and appearance of the survivor. But without direct proof, the case stalled and the driver disappeared from records entirely. Investigators also began noticing clusters, geographic hot zones where victims appeared with disturbing frequency. The I-5 corridor became a focal point, but so did stretches of I-80, I-10, and U.S. Route 101. These were not small local roads. They were cross-country arteries connecting every major region of the United States. Anyone traveling them could move fluidly across state lines, leaving no predictable footprint. A killer could strike in Washington, dispose of evidence in Oregon, and be in California by sunrise. Hitchhikers made easy targets. They willingly entered strangers' vehicles, leaving little to no trace at the scenes. In some cases, bodies were posed. In others, dumped in haste. Some victims were assaulted, some were not. Some appeared to have been killed immediately after entering the vehicle. Others showed signs of having been held captive. There was no consistent pattern across all murders, which led some investigators to conclude they were dealing not with one killer, but multiple hunters who saw the highway system as a hunting ground. But the possibility of one exceptionally unpredictable killer, someone who deliberately changed methods and patterns, was always on the table. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of these investigations was realizing how many victims would forever remain unidentified. Without modern DNA technology, the 1970s and 1980s were a time when unidentified bodies were logged, tagged, and buried with little hope of future discovery. It was only decades later that some Jane Does were named through forensic genealogy, giving closure to families who had once been told their loved ones probably just ran away. But even today, dozens, if not hundreds, remain unidentified, their brief final journeys ending in lonely roadside graves. The emotional toll on investigators was immense. Many officers who worked these cases carried the weight of them for decades. Some retired still believing the truth was somewhere in the mountains of paperwork and evidence boxes stored in back rooms. Others believed the killers, whether one, two, or many, died without ever being caught, turning the truth into ghost stories whispered along the highway patrol lines. If you work long enough on night shifts along the interstate, you realize some shadows never leave. And in the end, with countless suspects, multiple overlapping victims, and a timeline spanning thousands of miles, the truth about the hitchhiker murders became something bigger than a case file. It became a symbol of a dark chapter in American history, a chapter where freedom and danger blurred, where trust turned lethal, and where the open road became a vast hunting ground for monsters who used the endless miles as their camouflage. The deeper investigators dug into the hitchhiker murders, the more terrifying the pattern became. Nearly every major suspect looked ordinary. Not monstrous, not deranged, not visibly dangerous. They looked like neighbors, truckers, students, traveling salesmen, men who could blend effortlessly into daylight places before becoming predators in the dark. Scene 3 begins with the chilling realization that investigators kept returning to. The killers moved among everyone else, unnoticed, often admired, sometimes trusted, and almost always underestimated. One suspect was a mechanic from Northern California whose life seemed completely normal until detectives noticed that his work receipts lined up perfectly with the dates and locations of several disappearances. He had been present in Oregon the day a young woman vanished from outside a diner. 2 weeks later, his credit card placed him near a rest stop where a body was discovered. Another month later, a hitchhiker described escaping from a man with a car full of tools and oil-stained rags. The attacker never caught her, but the mechanic's description was close enough to raise alarms. Police questioned him twice. He smiled calmly, answered everything politely, and insisted he simply enjoyed long drives to unwind. Without solid evidence, he was released both times. Within months, 2 more victims were found along his same travel route. By the time investigators returned to detain him, he had vanished, leaving behind an empty garage and a set of disconnected utilities. Some believe he fled the country. Others believe he continued killing in states where no one connected his pattern. To this day, he has never been found. Another chilling figure emerged from the Midwest, a quiet, polite, long-haul trucker whose routes spanned nearly half the United States. Police first noticed him when a waitress reported a terrified teenage girl running barefoot into a truck stop restroom, claiming a trucker tried to lock her in his cab. The man she described had already driven away, his rig disappearing into the night. The restaurant camera caught only a fragment of the truck's paint color. But months later, detectives realized that the same shade appeared in witness accounts of missing hitchhikers on 2 separate interstates. When the trucker was finally identified and brought in for questioning, he denied everything. He even offered to let investigators search his truck. They found nothing, not even a trace of DNA. But later, forensic teams discovered the interior had been meticulously scrubbed with industrial solvents, the kind normally used to clean heavy machinery. The trucker claimed he was simply a neat freak. Again, with no physical evidence, he was quietly released. And again, shortly after, hitchhikers disappeared along his route. When police tried to track him down years later, His employment records had mysteriously vanished from the company's archives. No forwarding address, no family contacts, no trace. A ghost on wheels. But it wasn't only men who raised suspicion. In a case that still disturbs investigators, a woman in Arizona was reported for frequently picking up teenage female hitchhikers. She seemed friendly, offering rides, food, or a place to rest. Then 2 girls who had last been seen with her disappeared. When questioned, she said she merely dropped them off at a bus stop and wished them luck. With no evidence to pin on her, she walked free. Months later, the remains of 1 girl were found in a desert wash. The second girl was never discovered. Rumors followed the woman for years, but nothing was ever proven. Some believe she lured victims for another attacker, perhaps a partner, perhaps someone who promised her something in return. Others believe she was the killer herself, hiding violence behind kindness. Her trail went cold in the early 1990s, but the unease she left behind never faded. As time went on, investigators began linking certain suspects not only through physical proximity, but through disturbing behavioral overlaps. One man, a former military police officer, was stopped in Colorado with handcuffs, ropes, and hunting knives in the trunk of his car. He explained they were old gear from his service days. Weeks later, a hitchhiker's body was found displaying restraint marks. When police brought him in again, he had already relocated to a different state. Another suspect, an electrician known for driving cross-country to visit friends, was reported by multiple survivors who managed to escape his vehicle. Each described the same unnerving detail. He smiled constantly, even while attempting to attack. Despite multiple similar reports, none of the survivors could identify him confidently in a lineup, and each incident occurred in a different jurisdiction, leaving no department with enough evidence to file charges. The electrician continued traveling for years. To this day, he remains a person of interest in at least 5 unsolved homicides. Then there were the suspects too dangerous to question. In Texas, an ex-convict with a violent history became the center of attention after a fisherman discovered a body near a riverbank close to his property. Police believed the victim was a hitchhiker. The man refused to cooperate, barricaded himself inside his trailer home, and threatened anyone who approached. A standoff ensued, only ending when he took his own life. Inside, investigators found a trove of personal belongings: backpacks, shoes, jewelry, diaries, items linked to at least 4 missing individuals. But with no clear evidence of how those items came into his possession, the man could only be labeled a likely suspect, not definitively the killer. Many believe he was responsible for far more deaths than the evidence revealed. Perhaps the most unsettling suspects were the ones who seemed to leave an emotional imprint on survivors. One young man from Idaho recalled being offered a ride by a middle-aged driver whose tone shifted rapidly from friendly to controlling. He claimed the man kept repeating phrases like, "You shouldn't be out here alone," and "someone could hurt you." When the young man asked to let him out, the driver refused. Only when traffic slowed near a construction zone did he manage to escape by jumping from the moving car. Police searched for the driver for months, but he had given a fake name at a gas station earlier that day. His vehicle description matched at least 3 other reported encounters from hitchhikers who described similarly unsettling behavior: paranoia, fixation, insistence on control. Whether he escalated into violence or was already a killer remains one of the many unanswered questions in the web of suspects. What haunted investigators most was the overlap. So many suspects had similar timelines, similar vehicles, similar reasons for being on the highway: a mechanic traveling for parts, a trucker running long-haul routes, a student driving cross-country, a loner drifting from job to job. The patterns blurred into one another, creating a nightmare scenario. Dozens, maybe hundreds of predators, possibly operating simultaneously, sharing the same roads, the same rest stops, the same stretches of forest where bodies were later found. It was like trying to solve a puzzle where every piece came from a different box. Complicating things further, forensic science in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was primitive by today's standards. DNA testing was limited, slow, and often unusable. Fiber analysis could only reveal so much, And hitchhikers, by nature, left behind few identifiable belongings. Many carried generic backpacks, thrift store clothing, and no official ID. Even when suspects were detained with suspicious items, linking those items to a specific victim was almost impossible without modern forensic tools. Rumors spread among interstate patrol officers that certain suspects were stopped repeatedly over the years, but always released due to lack of evidence. Some officers admitted privately that they believed they had encountered notorious killers decades before they became known. Others were certain that unidentified serial killers lived out their lives undetected, dying anonymously while the truth remained buried in old case files. To make matters worse, some suspects were protected by sheer coincidence. A man questioned in Utah for suspicious behavior was later cleared because he was confirmed to be in another state during one murder. But years later, when investigators revisited old reports, they discovered the alibi had been based on a clerical mistake. The date on the receipt was printed incorrectly. By then, the man had long since disappeared, and several more victims had been found near his known travel routes. How many other alibis were wrong? How many killers slipped through because of small human errors? But the darkest realization was this: many suspects were never questioned at all. Millions of drivers passed through those highways. Thousands picked up hitchhikers. Hundreds matched victim descriptions. Only a fraction were ever interviewed. The killers hid in plain sight because plain sight was the perfect hiding place. In the end, the suspect list became less of a list and more of a shadow. Dozens, maybe hundreds of names, some known, many forgotten, countless unidentified. The monsters in the hitchhiker murder saga were not supernatural figures lurking in the dark. They were ordinary people, men who offered rides because they knew no one would question their kindness, predators disguised as good Samaritans, travelers whose faces blended into every crowd. They were the kind of people you could sit next to in a diner, chat with at a rest stop, or trust with a simple ride home. And that ordinariness, the ability to blend, to appear safe, to smile, was precisely what made them so deadly. Scene 3 ends where the terror becomes most human, understanding that if the suspects painted the shadows of the hitchhiker murders, then the survivors, few as they were, became the lanterns in the darkness. Their stories were not just testimonies. They were living echoes of the victims who never made it home. Each survivor carried a piece of terror that investigators desperately needed, but struggled to hear, because trauma rarely speaks in clean, linear sentences. Yet these survivors, scattered across decades and states, formed a mosaic of near-death encounters that began shaping one of the most chilling behavioral profiles in American crime history. One of the earliest survivors was a college student hitchhiking home for Thanksgiving. She remembered the night with unsettling clarity because everything felt wrong the moment she got into the car. The driver, a man in his 40s with meticulously combed hair and a quiet, almost rehearsed politeness, kept asking strangely personal questions. Where she lived, whether her family was expecting her, whether she trusted people easily. She tried to give vague answers, but he grew insistent, repeating questions she had already answered. The road they were on was supposed to lead straight toward her destination, but after 20 minutes, she realized he had taken a wrong turn. When she pointed it out, he smiled and simply said, "Shortcut." That was when she noticed the child locks. She tried opening her door. Nothing. She tried rolling down the window. Disabled. He kept smiling. Her escape happened only because he hit a pothole that blew a tire. When he got out to check the damage, she scrambled into the driver's seat and unlocked the doors manually. She ran barefoot into the night, sprinting toward the headlights of an approaching car. By the time police arrived, the man was gone. Her description later matched several other survivor accounts. Calm voice, polite manner, a smile that didn't reach the eyes. Her testimony became one of the earliest confirmations that hitchhiker predators often rehearsed their charm laying traps not with violence at first, but with conversation. Another survivor, a young man stranded after his motorcycle broke down, accepted a ride from a pickup truck. At first, everything seemed normal. The driver told stories about hunting trips, cracked jokes, even offered him a beer. But as the road grew darker and emptier, the conversation turned unsettling. The driver asked, "Ever think about how easy it would be to disappear out here?" The young man laughed it off, thinking the man was simply joking. Then he noticed the rope on the floor, the shovel in the back, a tarp rolled neatly in the truck bed. When the driver suddenly turned onto a dirt road, despite the rider insisting on staying on the highway, he knew something was wrong. The escape that saved his life came from pure instinct. He grabbed the door handle, flung it open while the truck was still moving, and jumped into the brush. He fractured his arm, but he survived. The driver never stopped. Police searched for the truck for days without success, but this survivor's recounting was vital. It revealed a behavioral pattern investigators would later come to fear. Some predators prepared their entire vehicle as a murder kit, ready for disposal at a moment's notice. One of the most haunting survivor testimonies came from a teenage girl who had been running away from a foster home. A woman pulled over to offer her a ride. A friendly face, warm smile, soft voice. The girl felt safe. The woman chatted kindly at first, asking about school, family, hobbies. But gradually, her tone shifted, growing eerily intense. She began asking why the girl had run away, what she was afraid of, whether anyone would come looking. Her smile stayed gentle, but her eyes never blinked enough, never moved enough. Too fixed, too invested. Then the girl noticed something strange. The woman kept checking her rearview mirror, not to watch the road behind them, but to observe the girl's reactions. When they passed a gas station and the girl suggested stopping for food, the woman snapped, "No." Just one word, sharp as glass. The girl felt the air change. She later described the moment as the exact second she realized the woman wasn't helping me, she was studying me. When the car eventually slowed at a rural stop sign, the girl made her move. She pretended to adjust her seatbelt, then shoved her entire body weight against the unlocked door and rolled out onto the gravel shoulder. She ran into a cornfield, hiding among the stalks, while the woman's car crept along the road at a crawl. The woman never got out. She simply drove forward, slowly, as if waiting to see if the girl would panic and reveal herself. The police searched for the woman for weeks and eventually linked her description with 2 missing hitchhikers from earlier that year. She vanished before being questioned. Perhaps the most psychologically disturbing survivor story came from a middle-aged man who had been hitchhiking across the Southwest after losing his job. A well-dressed businessman picked him up in a luxury sedan. Everything about the man seemed respectable: expensive watch, pressed shirt, professional manner. But within minutes, he began subtly provoking the hitchhiker with personal questions, invasive comments, and sudden changes in tone. He alternated between kindness and hostility with no warning. One moment he was offering the hitchhiker money for food, the next he was snarling about how some people don't deserve a second chance. When the hitchhiker tried to end the ride early, the driver refused. He accelerated, gripping the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, veins bulging. The man later said the scariest part wasn't the threats, it was the calmness that followed them. At one point, the driver said, almost emotionlessly, "You know, people like you just disappear all the time." The hitchhiker spotted an upcoming rest stop, and as the driver slowed to maneuver around a sharp bend, he opened the door and leapt out, tumbling down a slope and into a drainage ditch. When investigators questioned him later, he admitted that what terrified him most was the man's sudden switch from fury to eerie tranquility, like something inside him turned on and off with frightening ease. Across all these accounts, investigators began piecing together a psychological profile that was far more complex and far more chilling than they expected. These predators weren't impulsive or reckless. Many were patient, methodical, emotionally disconnected. They practiced control like an art form, controlling the car's locks, the route, the conversation, the temple of fear itself. Most of them exhibited signs of deep-seated personality disorders, antisocial traits, narcissistic entitlement, sometimes sadistic tendencies. The highways gave them the perfect hunting ground: anonymous, transient, untraceable. Even more disturbing was the common thread among survivor statements. Almost every predator initially acted like a protector. They used the cover of helpfulness to establish trust. They didn't approach victims with violence, they approached them with empathy. Fake empathy, weaponized empathy. And only when the hitchhiker was trapped, child locked in, miles from public view, did their mask slip. A behavioral analyst later described their methods as predatory patience. These killers understood something primal. People let their guard down around kindness. Hitchhikers, especially, cold, hungry, tired, were vulnerable to even the smallest act of generosity. A ride wasn't just transportation, it was temporary safety, shelter, hope. Predators exploited that hope with almost clinical precision. In one chilling case, a survivor recalled the man who picked him up exuding almost fatherly concern. The man asked whether he needed food, whether he had a place to sleep, whether he was close with his family. Only later did the survivor realize the questions were not about caring, they were about calculating. The driver was determining whether anyone would miss him. One theme resurfaced so consistently that investigators added it formally to the behavioral profile. The predators were obsessed with vulnerability, not physical vulnerability, emotional vulnerability. They preyed on loneliness, fear, insecurity, wanderlust gone wrong. Survivors often remembered the eerie feeling that the driver was trying to read their soul. They later learned this was exactly what the killers were doing, probing for weaknesses, gauging how easily they could assert control. Some survivors blamed themselves for ever accepting the ride, but detectives repeatedly reassured them the fault belonged solely to the predators. These killers were experts at appearing trustworthy, experts at manipulating instincts, experts at exploiting the very human desire to believe that someone stopping on a dark road might be trying to help. And yet, for every survivor who escaped, there were dozens of victims who didn't. Investigators often wondered how many near-miss stories went untold because the person who escaped never reported it, embarrassed, traumatized, or simply grateful to be alive. How many killers passed through police checkpoints undetected because their most suspicious behavior left no physical trace? How many witnesses spoke briefly to someone who carried a body in the trunk but seemed normal enough not to raise concern? The survivors who came forward, however, shaped everything. Their stories provided the blueprints, the mannerisms, the psychological cues, the grooming techniques,
the escalation patterns, the subtle shifts in tone and demeanor. Their fear became evidence. Their trauma became insight. Their testimonies became warnings, written in the margins of every cold case file. Long before detectives began connecting the dots between hitchhiker disappearances, the cases existed as scattered tragedies, isolated dots on the map of America's endless highways. But by the time investigators reached the final stretch of the hitchhiker murder investigations, the pattern had become too unmistakable to ignore. It was a spiderweb woven across decades, states, and interstates, touched by countless hands, but traced back to only a handful of predators whose shadows extended farther than any single fingerprint or motive ever could. Scene 5 begins with the moment everything finally converged, when years of survivor testimonies, forensic fragments, behavioral profiles, and overlooked reports began revealing the chilling architecture of a hidden American killing field. The breakthrough didn't come from a dramatic confession or a sudden arrest.
It came from a dusty cardboard box in a police storage room in Arizona. Inside was a collection of old interstate patrol logs, witness descriptions, and incomplete roadside incident reports that had seemed unimportant at the time. But one rookie detective assigned to cold cases, a woman named Maren Albright, noticed something no one else had. The same make and model of an old pickup truck, a faded blue Ford with mismatched side mirrors, had appeared in reports spanning 12 years and 3 different states. The truck was always associated with the same vague description: male driver, mid-30s to mid-50s, calm demeanor, talkative, often described as helpful or friendly. Each report ended the same way: the hitchhiker vanished. When Albright cross-referenced the reports with survivors' statements, she found something else. Several survivors described a driver who talked too much, who offered small gifts like bottled water or snacks, who used the same phrases repeatedly. Details that were once dismissed as coincidence started looking like a script, a behavioral script. That was the turning point, the moment when investigators realized they might not be chasing many killers. They might be chasing one who changed states often enough to avoid patterns and operated with the adaptability of a predator who understood the darkest vulnerabilities of the highway system. But, as promising as the lead was, it wasn't the only one. At nearly the same time, a detective in Oregon reopened a case involving a woman who vanished while hitchhiking along Highway 101. The case had gone cold due to inconsistent timelines, but when re-examining the evidence, he uncovered GPS data from a long-haul trucker who had been driving the same route that night. The trucker, now elderly and retired, admitted he had once picked up hitchhikers frequently. He insisted he never harmed anyone, but detectives noticed inconsistencies in his story: how he suddenly couldn't remember certain stops, how he stumbled when recalling the faces of passengers, how he claimed to have never seen anything unusual despite driving one of the most isolated stretches of highway in the country for 40 years. The trucker wasn't necessarily the killer, but he had witnessed something he had too deep to admit. The investigation intensified when forensic analysts finally succeeded in extracting partial DNA from a decades-old hair sample found in the backpack of a murdered hitchhiker in Nevada. Modern testing revealed a shocking match. The DNA belonged to a man arrested years earlier for assaulting a woman he had offered a ride to. He had served a short sentence, been released, changed his name, moved states, and disappeared into the vast anonymity of the interstate system. When investigators went to question him, they found his trailer abandoned in the woods, dust covering everything inside, as if no one had lived there for months. The walls were lined with old highway maps marked with circles, arrows, dates, and strange notes written in a neat but erratic handwriting. Some marks matched known crime scenes. Others pointed to locations where no bodies had ever been found, potential victims still undiscovered. The deeper investigators dug, the more they realized the horrifying possibility that the hitchhiker murders might not have been the work of one killer or even a handful of them. Instead, they seemed to be carried out by multiple offenders who shared the same hunting ground, the same opportunities, and the same type of victims. It was a culture of predation that thrived in the anonymity of the open road. Some killers worked alone. Some may have crossed paths without realizing it. Others may have shared stories in truck stops, bars, late-night diners, quiet exchanges disguised as casual conversation. A few behavioral analysts proposed that certain killers even followed news of other murders, learning from them, adapting their own methods to blend in with the wider pattern. By the time the multi-state task force formed, dozens of detectives were comparing notes across state lines, matching tire tracks, analyzing toll booth footage, and revisiting old survivor accounts. They discovered chilling similarities: killers who used the same conversational techniques, who drove similar vehicles, who employed similar restraints,
who targeted the same type of hitchhikers: young, alone, vulnerable, often transient. The consistency suggested something even darker. Some killers had studied the crimes of others, refining their own methods. Some hitchhiker murderers were not just predators, they were students of predation. The case reached its emotional peak when investigators located a man long suspected in 3 disappearances but never charged due to lack of evidence. He lived deep in rural Wyoming, in a remote cabin surrounded by thick pines. When authorities searched his property, they found a buried box containing dozens of IDs, driver's licenses, student IDs, work badges, spanning nearly 25 years. Many belonged to victims whose cases remained unsolved. Some belonged to people whose families never reported them missing, believing they had simply moved on. Inside the cabin, detectives found a journal filled with fragmented writing, disjointed thoughts, observations, and instructions. Phrases like, "Trust is the first step," "Choose those with tired eyes," and "Never leave marks that speak louder than silence." It was the closest thing they ever found to a confession, but the man refused to speak. He smiled vacantly during questioning, refusing to confirm or deny anything. He died in custody 2 years later. His silence marked the end of his chapter, but not the end of the story. As the task force compiled evidence, they realized the dreadfully simple truth. Solving the hitchhiker murders completely was impossible. Too many killers had died, disappeared, or gone underground. Too many victims' remains were lost in forests, deserts, riverbeds, or remote canyonlands. Too many witnesses forgotten details, moved away, or passed on. But investigators continued anyway, not because they believed they could close every case, but because each piece of the puzzle brought closure to at least one family and brought clarity to a wider pattern that had haunted American highways for generations. The final report the task force released to the public stated an unsettling conclusion. The hitchhiker murders were not a single chain of crimes, but a constellation of violence tied together by opportunity, anonymity, and the vulnerabilities of those who traveled by thumb. The killers varied in age, background, and motive, but they shared one trait. They knew the road better than their victims. They knew where to disappear. They knew where police rarely patrolled. They knew which states lacked coordination. They knew how to exploit distance like a weapon. In the end, what investigators uncovered was more than a list of suspects. It was a blueprint for how danger hides in the spaces between towns, where the lights fade, where the asphalt stretches into emptiness. The hitchhiker murders became a symbol not just of criminal acts, but of how the American highway, a place associated with freedom, adventure, escape, could also become a place where people vanished into myth. Yet the survivors, the detectives, the families, they kept the story alive. Their voices prevented the victims from becoming nameless. Their persistence kept the cold cases warm. Their testimonies, raw, trembling, often whispered, became the legacy that outlived the killers who thought they had buried their crimes in the endless miles of open road. In the final pages of the investigation, one line stood out, a line that captured the truth detectives carried with them long after the case was archived. Monsters don't live under beds. They drive past you with a smile, offering help on the loneliest nights. And that realization became the chilling, enduring conclusion. Some roads never forget what was done upon them, and some killers never stop driving